Hi. I'm going to talk about the results of ICP-MS analysis on the ongoing study about environmental and cultural exposure to hazardous substances such as heavy metals. The monastery at Fyrirlestraröð, located east of the Vatnajökull glacier on the Veiðivatn volcanic system, was established shortly after the eruption in 1477 at Veiðivatn. Volcanic emissions can travel very long distances. For example, in Hawaii, Mount Kilauea produces about 270 tons of mercury per year and has been identified as the source of large amounts of mercury found on Oahu over 320 kilometers away. In the case of Fyrirlestraröð, the volcanic ash from the south extends just to the area east of the glacier. Volcanic emissions don't only occur during eruptions, but also consistently appear between them and in geothermal systems as well. During eruptions, gases and other volatile elements are swept up into the air, works itself into crops, topsoil, and water sources, thereby contaminating it, which has occurred in southern Iceland after the Mount Hekla eruption in 1970, or the Heimaey eruption in 1973. While the eruptions themselves are relatively short-lived, the deposited ashfall following eruption can remain in the environment for decades or longer and can be remobilized by the wind or human and animal activities. Heavy metal toxicity has been connected with innumerable degenerative, neurological, psychological, developmental, and other pathological conditions, and in severe cases, death. However, people may also suffer from less severe non-specific symptoms such as fatigue, confusion, or insomnia, for example, from either acute or chronic low-level exposure. In the Middle Ages, mercury was often used as a treatment for syphilis and other diseases like leprosy. Otherwise, it was used as a pigment in ink, in beauty products, paint, and scholarly work, and during the gilding of metallic objects. Significant exposure to mercury often occurred in the past amongst alchemists, cinnabar miners, metal workers, scholars, and physicians or the sick. As Fyrirlestraröð was both a hospital and a monastery, the high mercury concentrations in the skeletal remains may either be traced to environmental emissions, writing, marine food consumption, housing interiors, or to medical treatments such as for syphilis. Lead and arsenic and cadmium can contaminate soil, water, and air through environmental emissions or cultural activities like mining, gilding, or smelting, or consuming food or drink from vessels made from these elements. This paper aims to explore these possibilities, but will focus primarily on mercury at this time. In the presentation, I will provide some background to the project discussing syphilis, alchemy, and Mercurial Medicine before presenting the results of the study. While various studies have shown that lead is passively absorbed by bone in the burial environment and was ubiquitous in medieval Northern Europe, mercury is uncommon in nature and humans are not prone to the same postmortem uptake that is seen with lead. So diagenetic factors are much less of a concern with mercury than with other heavy metals. It also does not accumulate to significant concentrations in the teeth or bones of healthy people except in special circumstances such as environmental or occupational exposure, or the more recent uses of the element in dental amalgams or fillings for cavities and thermometers. Methyl mercury accumulation from the consumption of sea fish and mammals is an exception to this because of the biological cycles that it undergoes. The hydroxyapatite, or the mineral and matrix component of teeth and bone, is known to retain mercury by replacing calcium and bonding with carbonates during life, and therefore should not undergo extensive postmortem uptake, indicating that if it is found in archaeological remains, there is likely a component of antemortem mercurial toxicity. Regardless, recent research on skeletal material undergoing fossilization has exhibited that recrystallization of the bone apatite leading to diagenetic uptake of certain earth elements does occur, but it just indicates that post-mortem contamination must still be considered, particularly if the remains are in advanced states of mineralization. The origins and movement of venereal syphilis remains a topic of ongoing debate. However, it is commonly believed that venereal syphilis appeared in Europe in the 15th century. These images here depict 3 different cases of syphilis from Fyrirlestraröð, and the middle image is an artistic representation of people tending to syphilis sufferers. Despite the 16th century written accounts of barber surgeons coming to Iceland to treat individuals suffering from syphilitic infections, it was commonly believed that it was not found in Iceland until later times. These practitioners likely focused on treating external skin lesions with surgery and medicinal mixtures, but may have also administered the treatments that were available at the time using mercury. In Iceland, the Fyrirlestraröð monastery is the only excavated archaeological site where syphilis has been diagnosed from medieval skeletal remains. However, it is the only archaeological identified medieval monastic hospital. In the past, syphilis may have been mistaken for a number of other diseases, such as leprosy, that cause abnormal skin lesions, thereby leaving an incomplete view of its presence and mobility in the past. Many individuals may have avoided seeking treatment, particularly at religious institutions where it was usually available, and medical practitioners may have chosen to record the condition as something else entirely to protect their patients from social exclusion. Additionally, the representation of syphilis in historical records may also be low because of the propensity to define the condition as something else. Just because these types of diseases had associations with deviant behavior. These factors, as well as the osteological paradox, may partly explain the past assumption that the disease did not arrive in Iceland until the modern period. It was common for monks to act as physicians and prepare medicines based upon Galenic formulations, which were often composed of a mixture of herbal plants, minerals, metals, and animal parts. Monastic hospitals aimed to accommodate the changing needs of the society they operated in, therefore requiring the development of treatments for the pathological conditions a community faces. Due to the close ties the Icelandic Church kept with the Catholic Church on the European continent, cultural exchanges in the form of ideas and practices prevailed. Similarly, during the 15th centuries, traders from Europe, particularly Germany, the Netherlands, England, and Denmark, dictated the majority of trade between Iceland and the mainland, presumably carrying disease with them. The history of alchemy and the importance of mercury within it is woven with the religious, philosophical, and scientific ideologies of the time, and was practiced by a wide range of people, including kings, popes, doctors, and clergymen. The origin and rise of alchemy occurred at different times throughout the world as it depended upon access to materials. And while it is deeply rooted with spiritual philosophies, it was often aiming to transmute metals into gold or silver, or to create elixirs for eternal life or the healing of disease. While the medical use of precious metals such as silver and gold were described in a number of texts, poisonous elements including arsenic, lead, and mercury were also described as important ingredients in these very medicines and alchemical elixirs. Mercury was believed to be the basis of all metals, including gold, and was therefore considered to be one of the tria prima, or the 3 principles. The distillation of metals into components, such as the fire distillation of the tria prima of salt, sulfur, and mercury, became a major focus of alchemists in the medieval period. This distillation would allow the alchemists to remove what they deemed to be impurities prior to recombining the components into a refined form of the original substance. In the 13th century, alchemists began to regularly use cinnabar, or mercury sulfur, as a medicinal elixir, as it was believed to impart long life due to its deep red color and associations with blood and the soul. Likewise, alchemists began their search for the philosopher's stone, a substance that could turn metals like mercury into gold or silver. The practice of sublimating gold, sulfur, and mercury in order to produce medicines and elixirs still occurs today in some cultural traditions, including in China and in India. It is believed that mercury can ward off evil, purify the home, incite love, luck, or money, or even increase your muscle mass. Mercury is found in many forms, including elemental, inorganic, and organic forms. Elemental mercury is the most pure form, and it's the form that was used in medical treatments. As mercury is rarely found in its elemental form in nature, it must be extracted from inorganic forms, such as cinnabar. During distillation, the ore is heated to 500 or 600 degrees Celsius, causing the extraction of mercury vapor, which is then collected, condensed, and allowed to return to room temperature, resulting in a liquid form. Once mercury is converted into this form, it must remain contained and have its movement prevented, otherwise it can evaporate quickly into the atmosphere. It's the only metal that exists at room temperature in liquid form, and that even a slight increase in temperature can result in its vaporization. The uses and compositions of ancient medicines are primarily known from the written historical records of ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, China, India, and Persia. These medical texts describe surgical practices, medicinal plants, alchemical elixirs, philosophies, and other therapeutic recipes. Pliny, Galen, Paracelsus, and John of St. Amand all discuss the medical uses as well as the poisonous attributes of mercury and other heavy metals. In 850, Irish monks prescribed a mixture of mercury and old butter to treat lice. Later, it was suggested in the canon of medicine that mercury could be used to treat skin disease. The antisyphilitic treatment was ideally administered by inhaling mercurial vapors and by rubbing a salve upon the lesions within a warm enclosed space. Some physicians also prescribed pills that were made of mercury mixed with other ingredients like honey, cinnamon, and senna. Individuals with syphilis were normally prescribed a 1-year course of mercurial treatment via vapor inhalation. Due to its highly poisonous nature, it is difficult to determine whether mercury provided many beneficial effects to those receiving treatment in the past. Aside from the toxic properties of mercurial medicine, its inhibition of the immune system to fight off disease may also counteract any potential medical benefits it may have. In the 1500s, it became widely used throughout the world for treatments and in the process of amalgamation with low-grade silver ores. These uses played a significant part in the widespread marine contamination of methylmercury in the sea today. It remained to be the most common treatment for syphilis until the arsenic compound salvarsan, or arsophenamine, was introduced in 1909, and the first antibiotic penicillin was introduced in 1940. Although other treatments for syphilis were available at the time, including the use of Epsom salt, many physicians considered them to be dangerous due to their ineffectiveness. The individuals sampled in this research were selected based upon standard anthropological descriptions of the skeletal remains. Rib samples tend to provide average results skewed towards the end of an individual's life because they maintain a faster bone turnover rate than other bones. A total of 50 well-preserved rib samples were analyzed for this research. 36 of them were taken from individuals buried in all areas of Skriðuklaustur, showing various pathological conditions, and 14 were taken from individuals excavated from Skeljastaðir. Skeljastaðir samples were chosen in order to have comparative material that addresses these conditions in a different time period and representative population. It was also chosen in order to evaluate factors of ante-mortem environmental exposure to heavy metals, as well as post-mortem diagenesis due to its proximity to Hekla. The samples from skeletons excavated from both sites were selected from ribs in good preservation, photographed and placed in sterile labeled containers. In order to minimize potential sources of postmortem contamination in this study, only the cortical tissues from rib samples were used. The trabecular bone was mechanically removed with a scalpel, which was sterilized between uses prior to processing. The samples were then cleaned of any soil clinging to the cortical surface with a synthetic brush and distilled water. Each cortical bone sample was transferred into a basic analytical mill and ground into a powder, which was transferred to sterile columns using disposable spoons. The analytical mill was thoroughly cleaned after each sample was milled. Inorganic contaminants, cadmium, arsenic, mercury, and lead, as well as minerals, phosphorus, and calcium, in the bone and soil samples were determined by ICP-MS after mineralization of the samples with closed vessel acid digestion. Portions of powdered samples together with nitric acid and hydrogen peroxide were transferred to digestion bombs and were digested in a Mars 5 oven. The digested sample solutions were quantitatively transferred to polypropylene tubes and diluted with ultra-purified water. To minimize a matrix effect, digested samples were diluted prior to analysis. The concentration of the different elements in these digests was determined by ICP-MS on an Agilent instrument. At Fyrirlestraröð, samples 7, 15, 16, 23, and 34 show the highest mercurial concentrations. These samples correlated with individuals which were diagnosed with syphilis in previous osteological studies and were diagnosed and given as a differential diagnosis in my own analysis. These significantly elevated concentrations may be traced to mercurial treatments at the monastery, although antemortem environmental toxicity cannot be ruled out. At Fyrirlestraröð, samples 38, 41, 47, and 50 exhibit extremely high mercury concentrations. High mercury emission was characteristic of the eruptions in 1970 and 1973 in Hekla and Heimaey. Perhaps the Hekla eruption of 1104 had similar characteristics. As previously mentioned, bone is not prone to the same postmortem uptake of mercury as it is with heavy metals. However, soil samples from Fyrirlestraröð must be analyzed in order to further interpret these results and address the likelihood of diagenesis. According to a study conducted at the University of Southern Denmark, skeletal assemblages from historical urban areas in Denmark and Germany were found to have very high lead concentrations in their bone, while the lower socioeconomic class residing in the countryside had much lower concentrations. Their evidence suggests that glazed pottery was the primary source of exposure in the urban population and that the rural population likely had less access to and money for glazed pottery. However, glazed pottery was not the only source of lead contamination in the towns. Lead was also present in coins, stained glass windows, and lead tiles on roofs from which drinking water was often collected. Once lead enters the bloodstream, it is distributed throughout the individual's bones, teeth, and soft tissues. Lead concentration in blood is a good measure of acute toxicity as it has a half-life of about 28 to 36 days, but it does not necessarily correlate with lead concentrations measured in bone. Bone and teeth contain about 94% of an individual's lead burden, and its components may be stored for decades. Human bone is very susceptible to postmortem uptake of lead from the burial context. Lead contamination in the environment, as well as biological toxicity, may occur naturally due to environmental emissions or due to human activities or the use of lead in objects in living quarters. At Fyrirlestraröð, the severely high lead levels found in the human remains assemblage may rather be due to post-mortem uptake and diagenetic conditions in the burial soil. The dangerously high lead concentration in the soil may be the result of lead window frames used at the monastery, for example. Since soil samples have not yet been measured at Skeljastaðir, it is difficult to speculate about the origin of the concentrations seen in the skeletal remains there. Arsenic has been used in traditional Indian and Chinese medicine since at least 200 BCE, as an elixir for treating disease and to induce perpetual life. The poisonous effects of arsenic was also noted at this time. It became regularly used as a poison due to its odorless and tasteless nature and was called the poison of kings and the king of poisons. By the 16th century, arsenic was included in a long list of chemically prepared medicinal tinctures and balsams. These medicines were used particularly by barber surgeons to treat lesions caused by sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis and chlamydia, but were also used to treat buboes associated with the Black Death. Later, arsenic powder was used to whiten the face and hair and to tend to scalp infections with things like lice. Although about 1/3 of the Earth's arsenic comes from environmental emissions such as volcanic eruptions, arsenic levels in Icelandic rock are generally lower than in neighboring countries. However, this does not necessarily reflect short-term increases in arsenic concentration with environmental origin. While the majority of individuals in this research show normal arsenic concentrations, 7 individuals from Skriðuklaustur were significantly higher than the others. Arsenic is a byproduct of mining tin and copper and is also commonly found in sulfur and other metals. Perhaps arsenic was present within the refined sulfur found at Skriðuklaustur, which is another substance that was commonly used for its medical powers in the past and in the present. All the samples measured from individuals at Skeljastaðir had concentrations around the normal range, which is interesting due to its proximity to Hekla and other geothermal activity. In 1817, a physician discovered cadmium while roasting zinc oxide to create a medical preparation. Cadmium was not used as a medicine itself, but was present in many zinc oxide preparations, thereby causing accidental poisoning to patients during treatment. In this research, cadmium was measured in order to assess environmental contaminants. For example, Icelandic freshwater fish contain much higher levels of cadmium than freshwater fish found in North America, and the relatively high concentrations of cadmium in sea fish and the marine environment has been attributed to volcanic emissions. Cadmium exposure causes an increase in osteoclastic activity, which results in the demineralization of bone as it dissolves the bone matrix and releases calcium stores, leading to osteoporosis and other conditions. Recent clinical research shows that this bone response begins to occur within hours of exposure, with blood concentrations as low as just 0.005 parts per million, or milligrams over kilograms. The majority of the samples from Skeljastaðir exhibit elevated cadmium concentrations, 4 of which are severely high. This could be due to antemortem exposure to volcanic particulates or to postmortem uptake in the burial environment as a result of the site's proximity to environmental emissions. The individuals at Skriðuklaustur also show elevated levels of cadmium, however, only a few of them show high concentrations. This proximity, as well as the distance from the Veiði volcanic system, may be correlated with these figures, particularly as emission contents are not the same in all volcanic systems. Mercury in soil is relatively low where anthropogenic origin does not occur. However, the primary sources of mercury mineralization occurs in volcanic hot springs and sedimentary rocks that are altered by phreatic activity. Following eruptions, atmospheric mercury concentrations rise as a direct result of the emissions and due to the formation of soluble mercury compounds in atmospheric water. As a result, eruptions and geothermal activity may be considered a serious source of heavy metal contamination in soil and sediments. Soil from Skriðuklaustur exhibited a lead concentration of 3.5 grams per kilogram, which is dangerously high, particularly upon consumption or inhalation. Those working at Fyrirlestraröð today have been informed of this hazard. Mercury does not absorb well through the skin itself, indicating that elevated mercury levels are more likely due to vapor inhalation, of which at least 74 to 80% is retained as it is dispersed throughout the body, first going to the brain and the lungs, for example. Mercury has a half-life of about 60 days and is eliminated through exhaled hair, saliva, sweat, and excrement. High concentrations of mercury remaining in rib bone samples from human skeletal remains could indicate a period of exposure near to the time of death. While assessing the presence of mercury in individuals found at Fyrirlestraröð cannot be used to diagnose syphilis, it may act as a useful tool in corroborating differential diagnoses based upon pathological skeletal changes of an infectious disease resulting in bone lesions. It must also be noted that the individuals administering mercurial medicine to a patient may have been subject to chronic toxicity, depending on the precautions they may have taken. The findings of this research illustrate that Iceland was not isolated from the outside world. Syphilis was present in Iceland at Fyrirlestraröð during the same time period that it reached epidemic levels throughout Western Europe. Furthermore, the medical knowledge and supplies for administering treatment to the sick was quickly circulated to Iceland, likely through the monastic networks on the European continent where these treatments were widely practiced. Access to treatment, whether geographical, monetary, or otherwise, must also be considered. It has been extensively documented in modern clinical research that sociocultural factors are, as well as geographic, architectural, and technological factors, are directly connected with the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis. Fyrirlestraröð, perhaps the individual suffering from ailments like syphilis made the journey to Fyrirlestraröð from throughout Iceland for treatment. Likewise, sick merchants may have entered the country through harbors in the east or the south and sought medical care thereafter. The results of this research have contributed findings with implications about life, disease, and medical treatment in historical Iceland. The possible use of mercury at Fyrirlestraröð as a medicinal treatment for syphilis, in addition to other therapeutic devices such as surgical tools, medicinal herbs, and refined sulfur, indicated that Iceland was far from isolated in the past and rather maintained a constant flow of communication through trade and monastic networks. This research hopes to contribute information about environmental and cultural exposure to heavy metals, as well as to our understanding of the normal levels of these elements in the local environment. The ongoing analysis aims to further consider diagenesis by measuring more soil samples from both sites. Fluoride, which is characteristic of many volcanic emissions, will be measured in the same bone samples. This research aims to measure stable isotope ratios of carbon and nitrogen to examine dietary protein consumption across time at the two sites. Strontium and oxygen analysis will also be completed in a subset of these samples for the purpose of considering the geographical origin of individuals with specific conditions or environmental signatures. In closing, I would like to note a few points of exposure to environmental contaminants. For example, in 2012, Iceland became one of the few and first states in the EAA to place limitations on cadmium concentrations in fertilizer after 11 brands carried by Shell Iceland were shown to have extremely high concentration, so the fertilizer used for growing food or other crops. Although heavy metals are generally low in Iceland or not a concern in most environmental settings here, perhaps it is worth considering the possibility of heavy metal contamination from the objects, soil, and structures found at archaeological sites in the future. And I would just like to thank everyone for their time and acknowledge these institutions that have contributed to this research.
Thank you very much. Questions? I have one question. There were several individuals from Fyrirlestraröð who had very high mercury levels, and a few individuals from Fyrirlestraröð which had very high cadmium levels as well. Are they the same individuals?
That's a good question. It does not appear to be. Oh, but Mercury said, yeah. 41, yeah, 41 is with high cadmium as well.
So that would probably...
Well, this is why I think there's a huge factor of diagenesis to consider here. And there's also, then again, I mean, the literature points to mercury not being taken up post-mortem the way that other heavy metals are. But if the bone was poorly preserved or not as well preserved as it may have seemed, then this could be a factor. Diagenesis could certainly be a factor. Otherwise, there's a possibility of these people just being affected by the same forces.
Yeah, so say, like, if they die a couple of months after a large volcanic eruption, that would explain these kinds of high levels.
It could be.
Both these
yeah.
events. That would be, you know, statistically that would be very unlikely.
It would be very unlikely, yeah. But that is also why more soil samples need to be measured. Ideally, animal bones would be measured too, because of course animal bones found, as Albina pointed out to me at one point, animal bones at each site would likely have different signatures than the people living at the site. So that might provide some control in considering this further.
Yes, because they should, if these are primarily environmental signals, then
right.
the animals
should show similar, yeah.
You talked about how sort of heavy metal poisoning can also be kind of affected by things like social status and geographical origin. I was wondering if, I think it's unlikely seeing as you're working on Christian grave material, but if there's anything in the sort of archaeological burial records that might signify those factors beyond kind of just looking at the heavy metal levels and saying like, oh, these ones are higher. I was wondering if you could make any comparison
between regions or
yeah, or just kind of so using the sort of the archaeological material to compare with the sort of individual results you're getting, or in terms of like geographical origin or sexual status in the future.
That's something that I have yet to fully address.
So I kind of think I understood from what you were saying that there's actually really not a lot of studies that actually look at these concentrations in bone, you know, in a non-archaeological context. Because a lot of times you're talking about like the amount found in blood levels, like the normal amount in blood.
Right.
So I mean, I guess that's one sort of the methodological problems, right?
Yeah, it is. And of course, you don't have much to compare to, especially here. A lot of the studies that are happening now are happening in Denmark and in Germany. But there have been some done in the States and in South America as well. But it is on archaeological material, but it is not so much. And it's something that people were doing a lot quite some time ago, and then it died out for a while. But there is still a lot that can be done with it if you have comparative material. As far as cadmium goes, it's one that has not been done very much in archaeological material. And the two publications I did find about it, they actually use modern bone samples to compare with their archaeological bone samples, because no one's been able to establish a normal limit yet as to what this range should be. It's also a problem that these normal limits could be different at different time periods. And some of the literature has suggested that you know, that these normal limits today are up to 5 times greater than they were in the Neolithic period, for example.
I was just going to suggest, because we were talking about the M15 and C13.
Yeah. Sulfur. Okay, thank you for that. No, that's a really good idea. I had not considered sulfur before because I have not seen any, I've seen very few publications on it, and as I'd heard, there are not many, there's not much comparative material yet, is there? That would be great.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you, Joe, very much.
Thank you.
Eins og sagði á, það þetta síðasti fyrirlestur í þessari fyrirlestraröð á þessu misseri, en ég reikna náttúrulega með að við munum endurtaka leikinn á næsta vorfesti. Árhaldur, þakka til að sjá okkur að fá.
Thank you.
Ég